There's a spot on the ceiling above your side of the bed, about the size of a coin, the color of weak tea. You notice it the way you notice a word you've read too many times, present, but not quite registering as language. You are lying on your back at 6 in the morning, waiting for the alarm you already heard, and your eyes land on the spot and slide off it in under 2 seconds. You think, faintly, that you should mention it to someone. Then your phone buzzes, and the thought goes wherever thoughts go when you decide, without deciding, that now is not the time. Downstairs, the coffee maker clicks on by itself because you set the timer the night before so you wouldn't have to talk before you'd had caffeine. This has become a habit you don't examine. Some habits are built the way sandcastles are built, one handful at a time with a plan. This one was built the way erosion works. No one chose it. It simply kept happening until it was permanent. Your partner is already at the table, scrolling with the particular stillness of someone who heard you get up and decided not to say anything either. There's a mug for you, poured but not yet handed over, a small courtesy that used to come with a comment, a joke, a hand brushing yours. Now it just appears, like weather. You say good morning. They say it back. Neither of you looks up. It is, on the surface, a perfectly fine morning. Nothing has gone wrong. This is important to notice, because nothing going wrong is exactly how it starts. 3 days earlier, they'd said, almost as an afterthought while rinsing a dish, that the two of you should probably sit down and talk about the schedule. Who's picking up which shifts? Who's dropping off what? Why it always seems to land on the same person. You'd said, "Yeah, definitely, let's do that this weekend." You meant it when you said it. That's the part people forget about avoidance. It rarely feels like lying in the moment. It feels like postponing. The weekend came. You suggested a movie instead, because you'd both had a long week, and it seemed cruel to spend the one free evening arguing about calendars. They agreed. You told yourself you'd read the room correctly. You are, in general, good at reading rooms. This is not a flaw. It's a skill you built early, in a house where raised voices meant something was about to break. A dish, a door, a version of the evening you'd been hoping for. You learned to feel the temperature of a room before anyone else noticed it was changing. You learned to say the thing that lowered the temperature, even if it wasn't quite the true thing. Nobody taught you this on purpose. You just got good at it, the way children get good at whatever keeps them safe. So when your partner brings up the schedule again, this time not as an afterthought, but with a flatness in her voice that means she said it in her head several times before saying it out loud, you feel the temperature shift, and your body does what it has always done. It reaches for the nearest exit that doesn't look like an exit. You say you're not trying to avoid it, you just want to talk about it when you're not both exhausted, because you want to actually solve it, not just have a tense conversation that goes nowhere. This sounds reasonable. It is, in fact, exactly reasonable enough to work. You might be thinking that this is just being considerate, waiting for the right moment, not wanting to dump a heavy topic on someone at the end of a long day. That instinct isn't wrong exactly. Timing does matter. But notice, if you're willing to, how the right moment keeps failing to arrive. Notice how it is never quite the right moment, week after week, and how the criteria for a good moment seem to expand exactly as fast as the moments do. A door that never opens isn't locked by circumstance forever. At some point, it's just being held shut. The stain on the ceiling gets a second look about 2 weeks later, after a night of hard rain. It hasn't grown, not that you can tell, but it seems darker somehow, more committed to being there. You mention it to your partner, and she says maybe it's just old water damage from before you moved in, and you both agree, in the easy way people agree about small things, that you'll keep an eye on it. This is a satisfying sentence to say. Keep an eye on it implies vigilance without requiring action. It lets you feel responsible while doing nothing. You start doing the same thing with the schedule conversation, except you don't call it that. You call it giving her space. You call it not wanting to force something. What you are actually doing is noticing the tension rise in small increments and routing around it, the way water finds the lowest path without ever announcing where it's headed. She stops bringing it up out loud and starts bringing it up in other ways. A sigh when she checks the calendar, a slightly too quick, "it's fine," when you ask if everything's okay, a night where she goes to bed 40 minutes before you instead of waiting up to watch one more episode together. You register all of this. You are, as established, good at reading rooms. You just don't act on what you read. Reading and responding turned out to be two very different skills, and somewhere along the way, you only ever developed one of them. At work, a parallel thing is happening, quieter, because it involves someone you don't love, which somehow makes it easier to ignore and harder to name. A colleague, someone you manage, technically, though you've never liked the word, has been missing deadlines, small ones at first. Then a client-facing one. You notice. You draft in your head several versions of the conversation you should have with him. In one version, you're direct and kind. In another, you're firm. You rehearse none of them out loud. Instead, you quietly reassign the next deadline to someone else on the team, someone reliable, someone who won't make you have the conversation. You tell yourself this is just good triage. It is also, if you're honest, and you are not being especially honest with yourself these days, a way of solving the problem without confronting the person, which means the problem doesn't actually get solved. It gets rerouted, the way the tension in your house gets rerouted, the way water finds the lowest path. Your mother calls on a Tuesday. You watch the screen light up with her name and let it ring out, telling yourself you'll call back after dinner. You don't call back after dinner. You tell yourself you'll call tomorrow during your lunch break when you'll actually have the bandwidth to have whatever conversation this turns into, because a call from your mother on a weekday is never just a call. It's an opening. It's an invitation to talk about your father's health, or her loneliness since the divorce, or the vague circling disappointment she's never quite named but always seems to be gesturing at. You are not avoiding your mother. You would say, if asked, that you love your mother very much. You are avoiding the specific shape of what talking to her might require of you, and you have found that letting the phone ring is a way of avoiding it that doesn't feel like a decision. Ringing phones end on their own. Decisions don't. The stain on the ceiling spreads slowly into something with edges instead of a clean circle. You paint over it on a Saturday, standing on a step stool with a small tester pot of white that doesn't quite match the rest of the ceiling because matching it would have meant a trip to the hardware store you didn't want to make. From below, freshly painted, it looks almost like nothing happened. You feel briefly competent. You feel briefly like a person who handles things. Your partner watches you paint from the doorway and says, not unkindly, "You know that's not actually fixing anything, right?" You say you know. You say you'll look into the roof this summer. She says okay, in a tone that isn't quite agreement and isn't quite disbelief, and goes back downstairs. And something in the shape of that exchange, the way she didn't push, the way you didn't ask her to say more, becomes, without either of you naming it, the new normal. This is how a pattern becomes a relationship instead of just a bad week. It stops requiring active maintenance. It runs on its own. Months move differently once this happens. They don't feel long while they're passing. Only in retrospect do you understand how much accumulated in the space where 100 small conversations should have been. Your partner starts telling you decisions instead of asking you about them. Where to eat, what to do with an upcoming holiday, whether to renew the lease on the apartment you're both technically still deciding to keep. You notice again the way you notice the ceiling. You register it and let your eyes slide off. You tell yourself it's efficient. Someone has to make decisions in a relationship, and if you're not making them, at least someone is. At work, the colleague you've been quietly routing around eventually gets a formal review from someone above you, because the pattern you saw 6 months ago and never addressed has become visible enough that other people are addressing it instead, in a room you're not in, using language considerably less generous than anything you would have used. You feel something sharp when you hear about it. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something closer to recognizing your own handwriting on a note you don't remember writing. You could have said something in March. You had the sentence ready. You just never said it out loud, and now someone else is saying a worse version of it for you. You might be thinking at this point that this doesn't sound like you specifically, that your situation is more complicated, that the people involved are different, that your reasons are better reasons. That may be true in the details. The details are always different. What tends to be identical is the shape underneath them, a small discomfort, postponed, a moment that could have cost you something, avoided, a version of peace that isn't peace so much as the absence of anyone bringing up what's actually happening. You are not a villain in this story. Almost no one is. That's what makes the pattern so easy to keep running. Your mother's calls become less frequent, not because the situation between you improved, but because she has, in her own quiet way, stopped expecting you to pick up. You notice this the way you notice a room going cold. Not in one moment, but in the gradual absence of warmth you didn't track closely enough to see leaving. When she does call, weeks apart now, the conversations are shorter, more careful, more like two people describing the weather in different cities than two people who share a history. You tell yourself this is just what happens as families age and scatter. You do not ask yourself why it happened faster in your family than in others, or why the distance seems to trace so precisely along the exact lines you avoided crossing. There is a night, an ordinary night, nothing marked it in advance, when your partner sits down across from you at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she isn't drinking from and says she wants to talk. Not the schedule this time, something larger, something she's clearly practiced saying because the sentences come out smoother than they would if she were improvising. She says she doesn't feel like you're in this with her. She says she's tired of being the one who brings things up, tired of watching you nod and agree and then quietly do nothing, tired of feeling like she's negotiating with a wall that's very polite about being a wall. She isn't shouting. If anything, her calm is worse than shouting would be. Shouting would have given you something to react to. This just leaves you sitting there, holding a silence you don't know how to fill, using the same instinct you've used 100 times, waiting for the temperature to drop, waiting for the right moment to say the right thing. Except this time, there is no later. This is the moment. It has arrived without your permission, the way moments eventually do when you've spent long enough avoiding them. You say you didn't realize it had gotten this bad. This is, in its way, the truest sentence you've said in months, and also the most damning one, because not realizing was the entire strategy. Not realizing was never an accident. It was maintained, quietly, deliberately, one deferred conversation at a time, the exact way water finds its way behind a wall without anyone choosing to let it in. That same week, in a coincidence that doesn't feel like a coincidence so much as a debt finally being called, a patch of ceiling plaster gives way during a storm, not dramatically, not all at once. Just a soft, sagging bulge that finally can't hold the weight of everything that's been collecting behind it, and a slow, dark stain spreads across the paint you touched up a year ago, the mismatched white now curling at the edges like old skin. Water drips, unhurried, onto the carpet below. You stand in the doorway, looking up at it, and for the first time, you let yourself see what was actually happening this whole time. Not a stain you could paint over, not a schedule you could keep pushing to next weekend, not a call you could let ring out one more time, but a slow accumulation of every moment you told yourself you'd deal with it later, each one small enough to ignore, all of them together large enough to bring something down. You think about the sentence you didn't say to your mother. You think about the sentence you didn't say to your colleague in March. You think about your partner's hands around a mug she wasn't drinking from, and the practiced calm in her voice, calm that had clearly been rehearsed alone, in rooms you weren't in, because you were never quite available for the version of the conversation that would have needed you present. You are still standing there when the drip finds a new rhythm, hitting the carpet in a pattern too even to ignore, and you understand, with a clarity that arrives too late to be useful, that you have spent years mistaking silence for peace and distance for patience, and your own carefully timed non-answers for a kind of gentleness, when really the whole time you were just watching the water rise, telling yourself someone would mention it if it ever became a real problem.